Hello, everyone. Welcome to Eftertryk Magazine video podcast. Today, we're going to talk to a person who really doesn't need any introduction. We're going to be speaking with Professor Noam Chomsky, linguist, social critic, an anti-war activist, and dissident intellectual. Today, we're going to be talking about the Afghanistan war. We're going to be talking about the new Cold War with China. We're also going to cover the climate crisis and end the talk with a little bit about philosophical anarchism and perhaps its practical realization. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, so we're not going to spend too much on the introductions. Let's get to it. I'll begin, and I'd like to ask you, with regard to the war in Afghanistan, it has been dubbed the good war, usually in contrast to the war in Iraq. But I know you have an alternative view of what the war in Afghanistan was. So I would like to hear your thoughts about the justification for going into Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks.
It's a very interesting question. So let's go back 20 years. 9/11. It's important to recognize first that the United States didn't know who was responsible for 9/11. In fact, 8 months later, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, had his first major press conference. This is 8 months after. He was asked, of course, who was responsible for 9/11. This is now after the most intensive investigation, multinational investigation, probably in human history. He said, we presume that the perpetrators were Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, but we haven't been able to establish it. That's 8 months after the invasion. Okay, let's go back to the invasion itself. So what was the motivation for it? Well, actually, I think the best answer to this was given by the leading figure in the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance, Abdul Khalq, highly respected Afghan leader leading the resistance to the Taliban from within. He had an interview in October, right after the bombing started, with a leading Central Asia scholar, Anatol Levin, and Levin asked him, what do you think about the invasion? He said, the invasion will kill many Afghans. It will undermine our efforts to overthrow the Taliban regime from within. And he laid out those efforts. He thought they were promising. This will undermine them. But the Americans don't care about the Afghans, and they don't care about overthrowing the Taliban. What they want to do is show their muscle and intimidate everyone in the world. Well, that was pretty well, it was pretty much repeated by, in different words, by the American Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who was one of the main agents of the invasion. The Taliban very quickly offered to surrender. They would just go back to their villages and just be left alone. The United States could take over, of course, could then have Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in their hands. Rumsfeld's response to this offer was, we do not negotiate surrenders. He was then seconded by the president, George W. Bush, who said, same thing, we don't negotiate surrenders. We just use force. He was asked questions about Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. He said, I don't know anything about them. We don't really care about them. We have bigger game in mind. The bigger game in mind was, of course, outlined explicitly, publicly, not secret. They want to go after Iraq. That's a real prize. Afghanistan is nothing. Go after Iraq, major prize, and then use that as a base for going on to other countries in the region, which were spelled out. That was the plan. So invading Afghanistan, in fact, if the United States had wanted to capture bin Laden, who was then a suspect, remember, not guilty, wouldn't have been very difficult. Could have done it with a small police action, which probably would have been supported by the Taliban. And they would have been happy to get rid of him. It was a nuisance for them. They couldn't just throw him out because of tribal rules. You don't throw out somebody who's taken refuge. That's important for the Pashtun conception of proper behavior. But they wouldn't have offered any opposition if the US wanted to send in a police action. That's no good. We have to show our muscle and intimidate everyone. Well, then what happened after that is Taliban went back to their villages. They're Afghans, after all. The United States came in, its allies came in. At first, there are very good reporters who have been following this on the ground from the beginning. The best is Anand Gupta, written several books, has a recent article about it in the New Yorker repeating it. He said what others have reported the same thing. There's a report in the Washington Post today saying basically the same thing from another one of the few reporters who was actually in the rural areas. That's where Afghanistan is. They all say the same thing. At the beginning, the Afghan rural population was relieved that the fighting the war is over. They can have some peace. And they had this idea, they didn't know much about the United States. The idea is that many people in the world have. Here's this super rich country which can do all kinds of good things for us. So they hoped that the United States would somehow come in and deal with their problems of poverty and so on. That didn't last very long. As soon as the US forces came in, they started attacking Afghans, started bombing them. You know, bomb could be aiming at, somebody called it, they thought was a Taliban, but it could hit a wedding party and kill 40 people. So you recruit a couple people for the Taliban, the relatives. Special forces break into people's houses during the night, humiliate them, take somebody out and send them to a torture chamber. You've created more Taliban. This continued to go on until you had a substantial resistance in the countryside. How did the US deal with it? Intensifying the violence, either itself or the Afghan army that it mobilized, which used the same tactics. But they say now, the same reporters, is everyone hated the Americans, including the Afghan army, for pretty good reasons. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The United States, when it came in, didn't know anything about Afghanistan. So they looked for people who could carry out their orders. Who were they? The warlords, the monsters who were running the place. They're the ones who have savvy. They can put themselves forth and saying, I'll work for you. But they're not stupid. One warlord could approach the Americans and say, in this village over here, there's some Taliban, namely one of his enemies. Then the Americans would come in and smash up that village and create more Taliban recruits. This went on through the 20 years. By the end, the British co-op pretty much the same in Helmand province. And by the end, there was a huge resistance, popular resistance. Actually, the Taliban originally were based in the Pashtun. It's the largest of the ethnic groups, but it's extended. One of the few surprises, very few surprises in the last few weeks, was that the warlords in the Tajik and Uzbek areas immediately moved to the Taliban. That was unexpected. Everything else was perfectly well expected. It was obvious that the government would collapse. The government is just a morass of corruption, which has no support. Now, the Afghan army, half of it was just on paper, ghost soldiers. Others were soldiers who didn't get paid, didn't have ammunition. The corrupt leaders and officials were stealing everything. They're not going to fight for the Americans. So they just disappeared. All of that was plain. I wrote about it in advance, others did. The only people who didn't seem to understand it were the people who had access to intelligence. Intelligence had a different story. That's one of the ways in which intelligence gets distorted. But if you looked at the facts on the ground, it was plain what was going to happen. The surprise was the joining the Taliban by their former enemies, the warlords in the Herat and Mazar al-Sharif and others. That was unexpected. So now it's apparently a multi-ethnic, rural-based organization. Well, what about the withdrawal? This goes back to President Trump. February 2020, Trump made a deal with the Taliban, didn't even bother to inform the Afghan government. They're nothing. Afghan people, of course, don't count at all. Made a deal with the Taliban and said, American troops will withdraw in May 2021. Worst possible time. Onset of the fighting season. No opportunity to accommodate, to make local arrangements. We'll pull out, and you can do anything you like. He imposed no conditions. Just said one condition. Don't fire at American soldiers, which wouldn't look good for me. But anything else is your business. It's interesting to see the reaction of the Republican Party. It tells you something about US politics. Republican Party hailed this as a historic achievement by our great leader, President Trump. Take a look at their webpage. It was featured on their Republican Party webpage. And it stayed there up until the time when the debacle began. Actually, Biden slightly improved Trump's conditions. He delayed it a couple of months. There was a little more time. Added some conditions on the Taliban. So he carried out an improved version of what they were hailing as a marvelous historic achievement by the genius Trump. As soon as the debacle began, they pulled it off their webpage and turned to attacking the Democrats and the army for the disaster. You may have seen the Senate hearings where General Milley and others were called to account by Republicans who a month earlier were hailing the historic achievement, now denouncing the military for following what they had hailed. This carries shamelessness to a higher level, but that's the so-called Republican Party. It's not a political party anymore. Well, that's the basic story. Now comes the next stage. Now, there's a split in the so-called international community about how to deal with it. One approach is advocated by the China-based regional powers. It's basically the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China, Russia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, India, Pakistan. Their approach is to accommodate somehow with the Taliban regime. It's a miserable situation in Afghanistan. Masses of people are starving, the economy collapsed. So their approach is, well, let's give them some aid and support for the population and engage with them and make an effort to make their government more inclusive, less repressive, and shift the economy from opium production to export of minerals and their other resources. That's one approach. There's another approach, which is led by the United States and includes India, US ally. In the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, India opposed this, preferred the US approach. which is to deprive Afghans of any aid and assistance, to hold their resources, treasury resources, happen to be in US banks, pressure the IMF and the World Bank not to offer them assistance, just punish the Afghans as much as possible. This doesn't punish the leadership. Sanctions, we have plenty of experience with sanctions. They hurt the population. They usually make the leader stronger. The population has to huddle under the leader's umbrella just to survive. It happens over and over. The United States is the only country that can impose sanctions. Others go along sometime, but if they tried to do it on their own, nobody would pay the slightest attention. When the United States imposes sanctions, everyone has to obey, even if you oppose them. So take the sanctions against Cuba, the oldest ones. The entire world opposes them. The vote at the United Nations, last one, is 184 to 2. Israel goes along with the United States, client state has to. The rest of the world says no, but they all abide by the sanctions because US sanctions are third-party sanctions. They tell others, if you don't abide by them, we throw you out of the international financial system and you have other punishments. The world is basically the mafia, and the godfather gives the orders, and others obey whether they like it or not. It's reality, not political science. So pretty much that's what's happening. So if the United States imposes sanctions, like it on Afghanistan, like it or not, the rest of the world will have to obey. Maybe not China. They won't. They're on their own. That's one of the reasons China's an enemy. They don't just follow orders. It's not tolerable. But maybe the Central Asian states will go along with China. In fact, they've been shifting. They've kicked out the American bases and are moving towards the China-based Eurasian system, the Belt and Roads, the investment system that China's been carrying out. So that seems to be the way it's developing.
Thank you very much. This brings us quite neatly to the question of China, which is portrayed as a threat to the West, namely Europe and the United States. And recently there has been this new alliance, which seems to be a weapons sales alliance.
AUKUS.
AUKUS, yeah. And we have a big reaction from Macron in France because he's losing market share. What do you make of the... It is.
First of all, why is China a threat? Well, actually, there's a good statement about this about a week ago by distinguished international diplomat, former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating. He's right in the dragon's claws, right there. He said, what's the China threat? He said, well, here's a country that raised 20% of the world's population from poverty and moving on to become a functioning state. It's moving forward in the economy. It's independent of the United States. That's the China threat. The China threat, he said, is China's existence. That can't be tolerated. Let's go back to the mafia. The godfather does not accept centers of power that don't follow the rules. So China's a threat. It's not a military threat. The military threat is against China. China's ringed with US bases, with nuclear-armed missiles right offshore aimed at China. It's China that's under threat, not the United States. The United States is under threat from a potential rival that doesn't follow orders. That's the threat. Well, let's take a look at AUKUS. What's portrayed in the press and the governments is a problem of freedom of navigation. there is no problem of freedom of navigation. Actually, one of Australia's leading strategic analysts just wrote an important article about this. Again, he's right there. He said, no problem, no threat to navigation. And there is none. None has been raised. The problem is what are called the exclusive economic zones. The law of the treaty and law of the sea in 1982 established what are called exclusive economic zones, 200 miles offshore. There has to be complete freedom of navigation, but there should be no, quoting, threat or use of force. Okay, now that's interpreted by China and India to mean no military intelligence operations. The United States disagrees, says the United States has the right to carry out military and intelligence operations in the exclusive zones. Recently did, just a couple of weeks ago, in the Indian zone. And India protested vigorously, but of course, can't do anything about it. Well, China also protests, and they can do something about it. That's the contention. Can there be U.S. military intelligence operations in China's exclusive economic zone? Well, the wording again is no threat or use of force. I should mention on the side that the United States is the only maritime power that has not ratified the law of the sea. Side comment, U.S. doesn't ratify international conventions. That's an interference with its sovereignty. The Godfather doesn't accept that. So the issue is kind of a technical one. How do you interpret the law of the sea with regard to what does rule of force, no threat of force, or military intelligence operations? That's the issue. The United States on one side, China and India on the other. Well, obvious place for diplomacy to move in. The United States does not pursue sissified things like diplomacy. We can go back to Afghanistan. When the Taliban surrendered, the answer is, we don't do negotiations. We use force. Here's another example. So we send in a naval armada. Now let's come to AUKUS. The United States made a deal with Australia to send them a fleet of advanced hunter-killer subs with nuclear weapons. China has none of these. This is the South China Sea. China has 4 submarines, old submarines, noisy, non-nuclear, easily detected, and hemmed in the South China Sea. They can't go anywhere. That's China. The United States, of course, take a look at the nuclear submarines in the United States. There's a fleet of advanced submarines. Each one of them, a single one, has, forget how many, many Trident missiles. Each Trident missile has many warheads. Each U.S. submarine can attack about 200 cities all over the world. That's the balance of submarines in the South China Sea. Well, to correct this, the United States is sending more nuclear submarines to Australia, which Australia pays for, but then they're folded into the U.S. Naval Command. It's a very serious threat to China. There's no strategic purpose, notice. These subs won't even be in operation for probably 15 years. By that time, of course, China will have built up its military forces to counter this new threat, so we get an escalation. Again, show our muscle, show that we intend to dominate the world. Same with France. France had already made a deal with Australia to send conventional subs. The United States did not even notify France that it was being abrogated by the US-Australia deal to send advanced nuclear subs. So naturally, Macron was pretty upset. That's a blow to French industry, serious blow. They weren't even informed. There's a message there. It tells the European Union, here's your role in world affairs. If we need you, we'll ask you to do something. If we want to do something, we won't even bother notifying you. You're vassals. France withdrew its ambassadors, not recalled its ambassador in protest, the ambassadors to Australia and the United States. They didn't bother withdrawing the ambassador from England because everybody knows that England's just a vassal state. We don't bother with them. But that's how world affairs is shaking up. Well, that's the AUKUS deal. It'll escalate the crisis. It's tense. It's very tense. It can both. There's a mutual escalation. So the United States escalates tensions off the China coast. China sends warplanes into Taiwan's protected area. Those are the tit for tat actions. They expand. They can lead the war. A war between China and the United States, it means we're finished. It's over. Not just them, everybody. You can't have a war between nuclear powers. China doesn't have much of a nuclear system, nothing like the United States, but enough to attack the continental United States from the mainland.
Thank you so much. If I could just get you to speak a bit about the climate change. What do you see as the greatest obstacle in solving the climate crisis?
Two major obstacles. One is, of course, the fossil fuel companies. Second is the governments of the world, including Europe and the United States. We've just seen that very dramatically just in the last month. On August 9th, the IPCC, the International Scientist Organization, issued its latest analysis of the climate situation. I'm sure you've seen it. It was a very dire warning, much more than before. It said message basically was we have two choices. We can either start right now, cutting back on fossil fuel use, do it systematically every year until we phase them out by mid-century. That's one choice. The other choice is cataclysm, the end of organized human life on Earth. Not immediately, we'll just reach irreversible tipping points and goes on to disaster. Those are the options. How did the great powers react? Well, the day after the IPCC report, Joe Biden issued an appeal to the OPEC cartel to increase production. Europe chimed in by calling on all producers, including Russia, to increase production. This is a response to the IPCC warning that we have to start reducing right now. That's for political reasons, for profit for the oil companies. Political reasons is they want the price reduced. It's better for them. Joe Biden, the gas price is high, it harms his electoral prospects. Well, that's the reaction. You read the business press right now, major business press in the world, big discussion going on. What's the best way to increase production? Is it through the American shale oil fracking industry, or is it through OPEC? But how can we increase production best? That's the business press. Turn to the petroleum journals. Euphoric. We've just found new fields to exploit. Demand is going up. That's great. Well, let's go to the US Congress. The Biden program, under pressure from young activists, the Sanders movement, and so on, the program actually is a big improvement on any previous one on paper. Not wonderful, but much better than anything else. That's the program. Well, the current negotiations in Congress taking place right now over the big, what's called the reconciliation bill, initiated by Bernie Sanders, cut back very sharply from Sanders's proposals. It's a very valuable bill. It somewhat reverses the huge assault on the population during the neoliberal era. That's a topic in itself. But it's very much needed in the United States, and it's very popular among the population. They like it, including Republicans, incidentally. They all favor it. The kinds of things that Europe takes for granted, like child care, paternity leave, maternity leave, paid vacations, things that are normal in Europe are improved. They don't exist in the United States, but they're a slight move in that direction. So it's very popular, except with Congress. The Republicans are 100% opposed. Nothing. Won't accept anything. The Democrats do have a swing vote. The so-called moderate Democrats, who should be called ultra-reactionaries, are the swing votes. One of them is the head of the Senate Energy Committee. Also happens to be the champion in Congress of receiving funding from the fossil fuel industry, which is quite an achievement because they pay off everyone. But he's the champion. His name is Joe Manchin. He has a policy. He's made it explicit. It's taken from the playbook of the oil companies. It says, he made it very clear. He said, no elimination, only innovation. So no cutback of the use of fossil fuels. If you can make up something new, it's okay. So he's blocking it. There are climate change provisions in it, and they're already out, blocked. Probably won't allow anything else either. So the whole proposal's probably doomed. But on climate change, it's already taken out. Well, go to Europe, it varies. There are some countries like Denmark, for example, which are moving towards renewable energy pretty significantly. Others vary. But when it comes to the crunch, telling the oil companies, the producers right now what to do, Europe is, as far as I know, unified in saying increase production. Right after the warning, we have to start decreasing production. That's the world we live in.
Well, considering this, do you think it's possible to find solutions at the scale and time we need within the capitalist system?
Very simple, straightforward. There are very careful, detailed proposals that have been worked out, even by the International Energy Agency, which is a producer-based group. Detailed proposals, others by a number of economists, very good economists. One of them's my co-author, Robert Pollin, Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia, using different models. They all come up with the same results. There are perfectly feasible measures to meet the IPCC goals and at the same time make a better world, better jobs, better living conditions, improvement of the nature of the society. It's all possible. Furthermore, it's well known. The leaders in Europe who are calling for increased production know it perfectly well, if they're literate. And it's within maybe 2 to 3% of GDP, easily manageable. It's actually less than what the US Treasury spent to bail out the financial institutions during the current crisis, easily within range, a tiny fraction of what was spent during World War II. But problem is, can you get the will to do it? It's not going to come from the leadership. It's going to have to come from mass popular action. And the scandal, tragedy is that that's coming from only young people. The climate strike a couple of weeks ago, young people. The Sunrise Movement in the United States, which impelled the Biden administration to at least adopt a reasonable proposal on paper. It's young people. When Greta Thunberg stands up at the Davos meeting and says, "You have betrayed us," exactly right. She got polite applause, and then they said, "Nice little girl, why don't you go back to school?" Interesting reaction. We'll take care of it. But it can be done, but it's going to take plenty of effort and energy. There are major problems. Actually, today, this morning, they reported an IMF study that came out yesterday, International Monetary Fund, tried to estimate the subsidies that are being given to the fossil fuel companies. Their estimate is about $11 million a day of subsidies, mostly by the rich countries, to the fossil fuel industry. Some of them are direct, others are indirect, like by underestimating the costs of the use of fossil fuels. That's a pretty significant sum. It's going on every day. Well, those are the battles that have to be waged. There'll be one in Glasgow at the COP26 meetings in a couple of weeks, and then it goes on. It has to be unrelenting, constant. Where there is, the whole neoliberal period was basically class war. Had nothing to do with the markets or anything else, just class war. And this is another form. Do we want to hand our future of our children, our grandchildren, into the hands of elements that want to make as much profit as possible and don't care what happens tomorrow? That's one choice. The other choice is to move on to a livable and better world. And it's not going to be an easy struggle.
Great. If we could just move on to anarchism. I think it's a term that's greatly misunderstood. A lot of people believe that anarchism has to do with a chaotic society without any rules, which is quite different to the anarchism that you speak of. So could you just briefly try to explain what you mean when you speak of anarchism?
Well, anarchism has covered a very wide range. There's all sorts of things. But even the ultra-right calls itself anarchist, meaning we want power to shift from government to private tyrannies. It's called anarchism. But the mainstream, and the kind I think we should take seriously, has been based on a very simple principle, basic principle. Any form of hierarchy and domination is illegitimate unless it can justify itself, has a burden of proof. Sometimes that burden of proof can be met, very rarely. If it can't be met, dismantle it, turn it into a more free, participatory, cooperative society. So what an anarchist system would be is, it could very well have hierarchy as long as it's controlled from below. Like if I need surgery, I go to a doctor, not a carpenter. That's hierarchy. But I choose that. He's a doctor by virtue of my decision, our decision collectively, that some group of people can gain skills that the community needs. Okay, so as long as responsibility is vested in the democratic participatory community in every institution, in the workplace, in communities everywhere, then we're moving towards a free and just society. It can be a highly organized society. Can be a lot of planning about how we should distribute resources, what our policies ought to be. It should be, in fact, international in scope, ideally, but rich, complex organization, but based on popular democratic control and meeting the condition that any form of hierarchy that can't justify itself has to be dismantled in favor of more freedom. Then you can spell that out in many detailed ways.
First and foremost, getting rid of private tyrannies, I suppose. I suppose that the practical realization of this philosophy in economic terms would be to do something about those private tyrannies.
Well, there are many things that can be done, and in fact are being done. So one thing that should be done is the classic position of the workers' movements and the farmers' movements back in the 19th century. In fact, has its roots in classical liberalism. Those who work in an enterprise should own and manage it. We should move towards what radical farmers in the United States called a cooperative commonwealth, where the farmers themselves organize collectively, free themselves from the rule of the Northeastern bankers and market managers, do it themselves. That was the populist movement in the United States in the 19th century. They were beginning to link up with the growing workers' movement, which held that those who work in the mills should own them. No one has the right to expropriate the labor of someone else. This is actually classical liberalism. You go back to somebody like Wilhelm von Humboldt, one of the main founders of classical liberalism, said that a peasant who works the fields has more right of ownership than the landlord who sits in some palace somewhere. That's classical liberalism. Abraham Lincoln in the United States was classical liberal. For him, and indeed for the Republican Party, what they called wage slavery, subordination to a master, is just like slavery, except that it's temporary till you can free yourself. Now, there's a little difference. He talked about individual freedom. The farmers and workers talked about collective freedom, a cooperative commonwealth. That's a difference. But other than that, the roots are in the classical idea goes way back to the Romans, that subordination to a master is a fundamental attack on basic human dignity and human rights. That's been beaten out of people's heads by a century of propaganda. Now it's supposed to be a wonderful thing if you can subordinate yourself to a master for most of your working life. It's called getting a job. It was considered a horrible attack on human dignity for millennia, literally, up through the 19th century. Taken a lot of work to impose on people the belief that it's a wonderful thing to spend your waking hours following somebody else's orders and doing it in a way which is actually more extreme than totalitarian states. Like Stalin couldn't tell you that you're allowed to go to the bathroom for 15 minutes at 3 p.m. He couldn't do that. That's what's called getting a job. What kind of clothes to wear. If you're in an Amazon warehouse, what path to take between two spots. If you're working for a trucking company, a delivery company, you're not allowed to stop for coffee for 15 minutes, and we control you because we have a surveillance system in the truck. So if you do that, you get a demerit. To a couple of them, you get thrown out. That's called getting a job, subordinating yourself to a master. Well, not only the anarchists, but even the socialist movement, when it used to be a real movement, took that as its slogan. Workers' control of enterprises was the basis for the traditional socialist movement. It's long changed from that. But I think all these ideas can be reconstructed quickly. They are to a certain extent. There's worker-controlled enterprises, cooperatives, localist initiatives developing, which are sort of pieces of a more free and just society, which would follow general anarchist principles. I think unfortunately, this cannot happen in time to deal with our immediate crises. Timescales are wrong. The immediate crises of survival, will have to be dealt with within more or less the existing institutions. They can be modified, but they're not going to be fundamentally changed in time to deal with the crisis. That doesn't mean you stop working on the long term. You do it, changes consciousness, changes understanding, builds elements of freedom within a highly repressive society, but can be done. But the immediate crises are going to require working with the institutions that exist, may be modified, but basically them. We're stuck with that. And I'm afraid I'm stuck with the fact that I have to get off. I have another interview coming.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor Chomsky. It's been a true privilege to talk to you. We're not going to hold you up any longer, but the text behind you, is that the quote from Bertrand Russell? There's a text behind you. Is that a quote from Bertrand Russell?
Yes.
Yes.
It's a quote from Bertrand Russell, his famous quote about, bring it over so I can read it. Oh, you can't. Okay. You know the things that he cared about in life. It's a wonderful quote.
We'll put it up there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Good to talk to you.
Three passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life. The longing for love, the search for knowledge, and unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind.